Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. First off, we recently passed 20,000 subscribers, which is a huge number really. I never imagined the content that I make would reach that many people, so thank you all so much for subscribing, and if you're new, hi! Feel free to stick around as I will be making more of these videos for the foreseeable future. Plus, apparently the algorithm likes it. Anyway, tier 3 today, and it's another stupidly long one, so feel free to watch it in segments or take it at your own pace. As always, I really hope you enjoy. So, first off today is the aptly named Dickermax, which is a rather unimpressive vehicle all apart from the firepower, which I suppose really is what all light tank destroyers are about. This tank is equipped with a 105mm gun, and this time it's not a howitzer. This cannon has fantastic penetration and damage, the stock round can punch through 155mm of armour, and the upgraded round can penetrate up to 187mm of armour, all the while having 350 grams of TNT equivalent, which is brilliant really. It's actually quite rare to penetrate an enemy vehicle and not one-shot it. Additionally, this tank is quite famous for its gun depression, as it can depress to -15 degrees, which really opens up a lot of opportunities for it, as it can use a lot of areas of the map most other tanks can't. This is really as far as its advantages go though. Disregarding the firepower, its other assets are really quite bad. Firstly, it's very slow. Spade at its max speed is only 27 km an hour. You could argue this isn't too much of a problem for it, as its mobility is something you'll rarely need to use, apart from the initial push to reach a good spot. But its lack of mobility spreads to its ability to react. The hull traverse is very poor. It takes a while to change direction, especially when you need to swing the hull around to target an enemy. This is even more annoying as the horizontal traverse on the gun is quite limited. It can only slew 8 degrees either side, which really isn't that great, and this can lose you vital seconds where it really counts. If an enemy is attacking you from an angle, you often won't have enough time to get the gun on target, which can be quite annoying. Its armour as well isn't very impressive. The main part of the mantlet is only 30mm thick, with some areas being 50, but even this is lackluster. Nothing is going to struggle to get through realistically. And on top of this, it's of course open-topped, so any aircraft can slowly cut down your crew. So revenge kills from aircraft are annoying and quite common with this one. As for its playstyle, the most important thing really is what sightline you're going to pick. The angle you can cover without moving is very narrow, and your ability to quickly adjust is quite slow. A small trick to counter the slow hull traverse though is to slightly accelerate or reverse and then start turning the hull. This extra boost in mobility will help you swing the hull around much faster, and this technique is actually pretty useful for tanks that don't have neutral steering. As for where to play though, all you really need to know is the approximate range to your target and be able to retreat out of sight quickly to reload and cover. As long as you know how far away your enemies are, you largely don't need to aim for weak spots. As long as you hit and penetrate at a good angle, you'll likely easily destroy your enemy. And if you're playing at range, the only time you're really vulnerable is when you're reloading. The reverse gear is quite slow, only about 5 km an hour, but because of the gun depression, you don't need to poke a lot of this tank out of cover to fire. This is why ridge lines are what you should aim to be covering, as these locations allow you to fight while exposing as little of your tank as possible, and they also offer the quickest way to hide yourself while reloading. If you can get this tank to a spot you're comfortable with on any map, you'll likely do pretty well, as all you need to do is land your shot and make it as difficult as possible for enemies to hit you. This can be said about all vehicles really, but more so for the Dickermax, as it doesn't really have anything reliable to fall back on. Pros: great firepower, and the cons: poor mobility, long reload, poor survivability, and low versatility. Verdict: what do we think? I'd recommend you get it. It's a good lol pen gun for the low BRs, and if you really like it, it'll still work in the high BRs too, so it does have some longevity there. On top of this, it works great in an up tier, and it's always going to be a cheap spawn. This vehicle is ultimately great because it can comfortably deal with anything it fights. It's not the easiest tank to use overall, but it's fun to one-shot anything you see, and it can be quite rewarding once you get over the mobility problems. Next up is something quite similar, the Stura Emil. Main difference with this one is the gun. It's equipped with a 128mm gun that sports incredible performance for 5.0. It's not quite the same variant used on the Jagdtiger and doesn't quite have its level of penetration, but the upgraded round can punch through a max of 248mm of armour in addition to having just under 800 grams of TNT equivalent in the round, which is huge really. But like the Dickermax, its firepower is its only real advantage. Armour again is nothing special, it's 50mm frontally. It's also also open-topped and a bit longer, so it's actually even more vulnerable from the air. Its hull traverse is a tiny bit better this time around, it can make tighter movements a bit faster, but overall it's still not that great. And because of the larger gun, the reload is longer too, at 23.6 seconds stock, one of the longest reloads at the tier. The problem overall with the Stura is that it's just a bit overkill. The 128mm gun is incredibly powerful and can penetrate and one-shot basically anything with ease, but the Dickermax can also quite reliably do this at a lower BR, and with a quicker reload. And the next TD in the line is better still. All in all, it's the reload that really does hold it back. The damage is great, but it's not really worth a 20 or so second wait, especially if you miss. This tank is just so vulnerable in general, and having a 23-second window where there's nothing you can do is a bit too much. It has nothing going for it defensively, it's a huge open-topped vehicle with no armour, and because of the lack of mobility, it can't really reposition easily if it gets in trouble. Also, it doesn't really have much of a place in any lineups either. This is subjective though, as I know some players would rightfully prefer a one-shot cannon with a slower reload, but one BR jump away from this tank is a TD that I personally believe performs a lot better. Being light tank destroyers, all of these vehicles can work well in up tiers, but comparing all of them this tier, the Stura does really have the least potential to really excel. In practice, it does perform very similarly to the Dickermax, has the same great gun depression, so utilising ridgelines is the way to go for most consistent cover. It's actually so similar to the Dickermax that there's not really a huge amount of additional information I think would be relevant here. Mobility is very similar, the viability of the armour is practically the same, only difference is the gun, and that doesn't really have too much of an effect on where I'd recommend playing it. I will say though that this time around, the further distance you are from your target, the better. The reload really is long, and if you're playing in close-ish proximity to enemies, they will know they can rush you after you fire. At distance you are relatively safe from this, and also again, make sure you have some hard cover to retreat to after you fire. You're a very large and slow target, so it's easy to get caught out. As long as you can land your shots and avoid getting shot at, this vehicle will still work. Pros? Great firepower. And the cons? Poor mobility, long reload, poor survivability, and low versatility. Verdicts? I'm not sure everyone will agree with this, but my personal verdict would be to avoid it. The gun is great and really satisfying to one-shot tanks with, but its window of opportunity to be used effectively is very small. Its BR can't really be changed, and it's at a BR where its usefulness is eclipsed by at least 2 other vehicles with similar roles. It doesn't work well on most maps, it's really slow and sluggish stock, and it can be really tedious to use. If you really enjoy the Dickermax, maybe consider picking this up. It's functionally a downgrade, but it's really rare to not penetrate what you hit with the Stura. If that alone seems like a big enough advantage to you, you will probably like it. I would still recommend steering clear though personally. Lastly, for our light TDs this tier is the Nashorn, a fairly famous vehicle. This is also the first tank equipped with the long 88 used on the King Tigers. Its performance is really fantastic. The APHE round is stock and can cut through a max of 237mm of armour. On top of this, the Nashorn being open-topped has a fairly quick reload at 8.7 seconds stock. At a BR of 5.3, the Nashorn can quite rapidly knock out anything really, very few tanks give it trouble. It is, however, very weak, more so than the previous TDs. The flat armour on the face of the casemate is only 10mm thick, so heavy machine guns can take out the crew. This also makes it very vulnerable from the air, as an attacking plane doesn't need a perfect angle to strafe inside the tank. Mobility this time around though isn't awful. It can reach a max of 40km an hour, and its hull traverse is really quick as well. It can swing around and react to enemies fairly quickly. What it doesn't have though is decent gun depression. It's only capable of -5, which isn't awful, but it does limit the locations you can safely play it, as it does need a fairly concealed spot to work due to how weak it is. If you get hit and don't have somewhere to retreat to, it's very likely game over, so much like a lot of light tank destroyers, positioning is the real key to doing well with it. I'd suggest a spot that's not too far into the map. The long 88 can take out anything basically at any range, so distance to the target isn't too much of a problem. You also need to consider how visible you are from the air. If an enemy aircraft sees you, they know with 100% certainty that they can quite quickly take you out in a few strafes, so playing it around vertical cover near buildings or trees will really help here. as if you take out an enemy and they can respawn in a plane, they will of course beeline right for you, and there's going to be basically nothing you can do. There are some machine guns on the sides of your hull, but they can't actually elevate upwards, so they're no help either. You have no passive or active protection against aircraft, so this really should play into your positioning. This tank works best in ambush really around a fair bit of cover, especially as if you're not moving, aircraft will have a harder time spotting you. If you're sniping and you know the rough range to your targets, you can be really efficient. What I would suggest overall would be to take it out as your first spawn and head to a sniping spot you're comfortable with. This tank is so vulnerable and the late game is filled with aircraft and tanks all over the place potentially, and the Nashorn can't really work to its best in this environment. Because of all the variants in maps etc, I can't really tell you what the perfect spot is, but if you're a long distance away from your enemies, know the range and have some sort of vertical cover, that's really the best you can ask for. Pros: great firepower, fast reload, and decent mobility. Now the cons: poor survivability, and low versatility. Verdict: get it. This vehicle is important to have in the lineup as it can deal with basically everything in an up tier, and it can do this at a more reliable rate than the Stirrer or the Dickermax. The reload is really helpful and the performance of the gun damage wise is fine really. It is fairly map dependent, but it's always going to be a cheap spawn, and if you keep yourself protected, it really does have a lot of potential. So next up is probably what some of you are here for. This is possibly the most legendary tank in the world, the Tiger H1. Most of you know all its features, but for those who don't, it's a heavy tank at 5.3 which uses the KWK-36 88mm gun. In game it performs exactly the same as the 88 found on the flak bus in the last episode. It comes with two main APHE rounds. One has more penetration and less filler, and one has less penetration and more filler. The second round is completely identical to the round the flak bus uses. As far as which one to go for, it's up to you really. I personally use the stock round with the higher penetration as the improved performance against angles has saved me a few times, though most of the time you won't struggle to penetrate anything using the round with the higher filler. Of course though, it's a heavy tank, so arguably the most important aspect is the armour. And the armour of the Tiger is hard to really describe quickly as the cold data on thickness isn't constantly relevant, and plus I don't need to be patronising and describe the thickness of every piece of armour to you, you're all capable of doing that in the hangar at your own pace in a way that suits you. Its hull is overall well armoured at the front and the sides, which is really important, as it means the Tiger can effectively angle. It's one of the first German tanks to be able to consistently do this, as a lot of them so far have had very weak side armour, and adjusting to this is key to succeeding with the Tiger. Angling with the Panzer IVs and IIIs only really made the side armour more vulnerable, whereas it really benefits the Tiger. In fact, it's almost a necessity. So keep the thought in your head that when you're not angled towards an enemy, you're vulnerable, which is really true. The Tiger has 102mm of flat armour on the front plate. At 5.3, basically any enemy with a clean shot will be able to punch through that. But in angling, you can add 30, even 40mm of effective armour against some guns, which in certain cases can make your hull largely immune. You do need to be careful though. The Tiger's side armour is 82mm thick, pretty good, but the lower side is only 62, so in some instances when you're angling and make the upper front and side armour practically impenetrable, but the lower side can still be punched through, and this is really something you need to keep in mind. It's most vulnerable against Russian guns largely as they perform very well against angles. So it's a good idea to play around with the protection analysis simulators to get a good idea of what angles are safe. The turret armour as well is pretty good, although there's not a lot you can do to buff it. Some segments of armour will bounce most shots, and some will go clean through, so it's inconsistent. But on the whole, pretty good as far as turret armour goes. You'll likely find that you'll rarely get shot in the turret as enemies know that it's not the most consistent spot to penetrate. It's also important to mention that the cupola of this tank is quite large, and if a decent APHE round hits, it can knock out all 3 crew members in the turret. You can never hide the cupola or buff its protection, so if you're hull down or driving up from a defilade, enemies will quite easily be able to take out your turret crew before you even get a chance to fire. So if you are in this situation, be very wary of this weak spot. All in all, the Tiger is a very versatile vehicle. It can snipe, brawl and do everything in between really, with its effectiveness heavily depending on map and BR. The gun will largely perform fine. It can quite comfortably penetrate most vehicles. Mobility as well is pretty good for a heavy tank. It has a decent reverse gear and can hit 32 km an hour off-road, and when upgraded, it can turn pretty well too. Sniping with it is a pretty easy game. You just need to know your range and drive back and forth when fired at to throw off your enemy's aim. The gun might struggle a little bit at long ranges at the higher BRs, but overall you won't have too much trouble. Brawling though and playing at close range can be very effective, but it does require you to do a few things. Angling is the main one. Never drive out from behind cover side on, it prevents a very easy shot. But in my opinion, the most important thing for playing the Tiger 1 is to keep moving if you're engaging an enemy. This is how to make the armor as effective as possible. The Tiger is covered in weak spots, sure, but when you're angled and moving, the best weak spot for an enemy to go for keeps changing, and this buys you time to fire back. Most of the time, if you're slightly angled on the move, an enemy will bounce. The effective thickness of the armor keeps changing while you're doing this, so it makes it very hard for an enemy to decide where to fire. The turret overall is a lottery really, it might work, it might not. The angled hull though is great at catching enemy fire. The best heavy tanks can make use of something I describe as a reaction time window. An enemy has to aim well to take you out, so you usually have a slightly longer amount of time before an enemy can fire accurately at you. So they'll either do this, or panic shoot and likely non-pen. And against most contemporary tanks, this window of time you have is incredibly useful. The gun is also fairly accurate on the move as long as you're not at a higher speed. You can fire while moving, so you can even retaliate in this window of time, which is great. Mastering what to do in this grace period is one of the most important aspects to doing well in the Tiger. One negative it has regarding this though is its reactionary mobility. From stationary, it will take a while to turn the hull to buff the armor while neutral steering, and in some instances it's actually quicker to drive forward slightly and then swing the hull around on one track. If you do see an enemy coming, be sure to do this. In fact, if you are still, keep yourself pointed towards where an enemy could be coming from to avoid losing seconds performing this maneuver. Its ability to turn overall isn't bad, but because the armor's so flat, it requires more movement to get it to an effective thickness than most other tanks. A couple of further downsides it has relate to its firepower. Firstly, the turret drive isn't the fastest at 8.4 degrees a second. Not terrible, but it can catch you out, so use the hull traverse to swing the gun around quicker if you need. Additionally, on top of the hull, there are these little grenade launchers. They have no function in game apart from limiting your gun depression. Even more annoying is that you sometimes can't fire on an enemy while angling as the launchers are close to where the ideal point for angling is. And this is probably the most annoying part of playing the Tiger H1. You can still fire fine on flat ground, but when aiming at an enemy slightly below you, it can become almost impossible to do so while maintaining an effective angle. You can't do anything to really avoid this, and if you are needing to utilise the gun depression, make sure your gun isn't directly above them. What I'd suggest as well is that if you can help it, try not to move your gun past the launchers either side, and just keep it between them if possible, as the gun will stop and elevate over them in a very angular motion which will cost you a further few seconds. Of course you'll sometimes have to move it past them, but just try and avoid it as much as possible. Pros: great firepower, decent mobility, and effective armour. And the cons: large weak spots, and poor reactive mobility. Verdict: there's no need, is there? You're going to get it anyway, and as you should. Playstyle is subjective, but in my opinion, it's very easy to play the Tiger incorrectly, so if you are a newer player, you might find you struggle with it at first. But if you can keep yourself angled and mobile while you're being shot at, you can really turn the Tiger 1 into the embodiment of its legendary reputation. Next up, an all-around improvement, this is the Tiger E. While not offering a huge overall change from the design and playstyle, the E does remove some of the tedium the H1 had. Its turret drive is faster, and thankfully there's no grenade launchers blocking the gun depression. Mobility is a bit better as well, as it has more horsepower. Also, there are some light armor improvements too. Firstly, the cupola is redesigned. It's very hard to get a shot into it this time around, which is great. There's also extra track armor on the lower plate, which adds around 25mm of additional armor there. The turret face is also slightly redesigned, adding a 140mm block to the mantlet, which covers most of the weakest parts of the armor. It also gets 6 roof-mounted smoke grenades that fire individually. So, the E is a total improvement. It does also get EPCR, but that's rarely used to be honest. The only problem really is that it's at 5.7, meaning it can see 6.7, and against these tanks it doesn't perform too well. The American heavies and stabilised British tanks can give it a lot of trouble, but below that, and especially its own BR, it does perform very well. There's not really that much else to add for the E. I'd recommend playing it in the same way as the H1, it's just this time you don't need to be quite as careful. Pros: great firepower, decent mobility, effective armor, and versatile. And the cons: poor reactive mobility, and struggles in up tiers. Verdict. Get it. 5.7 has a very strong lineup, and while the E won't work amazingly well at 6.7, it will work great below that. And for those long maps and up tiers, you have plenty of high power tank destroyers to choose from. I definitely get the E, but I would focus on getting some backups before you start using it. The E on its own at 6.7 won't be very effective at all, really. Next up, back to the mediums with the PanzerforG. Strap in, because I've just made a really strong coffee. I'm going to put a bit of Red Bull in it. So hopefully this voiceover is about to kick off. Either that or quite aggressive defecation, I will let you know. Anyway, this is next in line from the Panzer IV F2, and all in all, not a lot has changed. The G mainly just gets a bit of extra armour, a 30mm plate on the upper and lower glacis that covers all the front apart from the machine gun port and driver's port. It also gets some track armour as well, in basically the same setup as the F2, and also gets forward-launching smoke grenades. And because of the extra armour, it's a little bit slower, but to be honest, you'd hardly notice the difference. So, the G is at 4.0, 2 BR jumps away from the F2, and the only meaningful change really is 30mm of armour that sporadically covers the front of the hull, which leaves weak spots by the machine gun port and driver's port as they're currently not modelled, so they're just flat 50mm plates. I don't bring this up to imply the G is over-tiered, if anything the F2 is under-tiered, but realistically both tanks perform quite similarly, it's just one is at higher BR. I'd say the G will perform a bit better when it gets its hull parts modelled, as they'll add more armour protection and functionally remove the weak spots it has, but for now it's not really a huge upgrade. That's not to say the vehicle itself is bad though, it still performs well. The gun can still quite easily deal with the vast majority of tanks you'll fight, and with a max of 95mm of armour on the front hull, it does bounce some shots. But the turret armour is the same, and even though the hull armour is better, it still can't really be relied on. At least not to the point where I'd suggest playing it differently to the F2. Playing it hull down at range is probably still the most reliable way to use it. Although, as the hull armour is better and more reliable than the turret armour, you do sort of want your enemies to shoot at the hull, but that makes you a bigger target, etc., so its extra armour doesn't really come into effect that much. Or at least, it only comes into effect when you're playing it in a disadvantageous position, exposed at close range. This tank loses a lot of its advantages here, so even though it can potentially make the armour work, it's not really worth all the other drawbacks that come with playing it at close quarters. It still works best at range, where you can make yourself as small a target as possible while keeping the penetration power of the gun. Not really that much else to add, as we've covered this thing's playstyle in the last video with the F2, and hopefully you've all watched that already. Pros: great firepower, decent mobility, and versatile. And the cons: poor survivability. Verdict: well, get it. It is an upgrade to the F2, and as it's in tier 3, it can research other tanks a bit more efficiently. There's a decent lineup at 4.0, and it can still function in a lot of different situations and become a backup in the higher tiers as well. Not a huge upgrade overall, but still a welcome one. Tell you what, this tastes like what I imagined caffeinated paint thinner would taste like. Probably better for me as well, this tastes like kerosene. Anyway, just spilt some, doesn't matter. Next up is the Panzer IV-H, which is really the most upgraded Panzer IV in terms of technology overall, even though we still have one in the tree to cover. It of course gets some additional screens to protect against heat, and the hull front is 80mm solid, so no weak spots. The driver's port and MG port are still not modelled though. The main advantage though is the track armour upgrade, as it covers pretty much all of the hull and turret in tracks, leaving only the ports exposed. This means that the hull is around 95mm effective thickness, which isn't too bad for a medium tank at 4.3, and it'll be made even better when the ports are modelled. The armour is only really potentially reliable at its own BR of 4.3, anything above that, and it doesn't really count for much. Most tanks you'll fight will have guns that'll have no trouble punching through. This, again, doesn't really change its playstyle much, it still works best as far away from enemies as possible. Even with the extra armour and the skirts, it still doesn't offer completely reliable protection. It's only strong from the front, and any tank getting a slight angle on the side armour will be able to take it out very easily. It can still work as a vehicle though, even without relying on the armour. The gun will still work, and it's still mobile and turreted, so it can work in multiple situations. It likely won't perform as well as the F2 or the G just down to the BR, but it does have functionality still, and you could even say that the armour will make it a somewhat viable late game spawn when there are weaker tanks rolling around. Pros: decent firepower, decent mobility, and versatile. And the cons: poor survivability. Verdict: consider it. The Panzer IVs really have had their day by this point, and the H, although improved, doesn't really stand out anymore. The armour can work, but it's unreliable and has a very narrow orientation where it can actually be strong. Its main application really is as a versatile backup, and even then it doesn't offer a huge amount over the G. If the extra armour from spading it seems appealing to you, go for it, but generally it'll rarely truly excel on its own as a vehicle. Next up is the PanzerforG, the last of the Panzer IV variants, and it's actually one of the worst despite coming after the H. So the J had its electric turret drive removed, so stock it has the traverse rate of 3.6 degrees a second, which is only a tiny bit faster than that of the early Panzer IIIs. Its armour model is basically the same as the H, but the track armour is actually the worst out of any of the Panzer IVs. It doesn't even cover the corners, which was actually fairly useful on the previous models. Its armour is nothing impressive, and it has absolutely awful turret traverse, and it's also 4.0, the same as the G, and it's folded with the H, so to get this vehicle you have to research and unlock an objectively better vehicle, which makes sense historically as it's a later variant, but not so much contextually for the game. If you get the H, there's no real reason to go for the J unless you want it as a backup, but out of all the long barrel Panzer IVs, it's easily the worst. The lack of turret drive really hurts it, even though the armour is better, so all of the previous Panzer IVs would honestly be better backups really. The only advantage the J has over the other Panzer IVs is a roof-mounted smoke grenade launcher that can launch 6 single smoke grenades in front of the tank, which is undeniably useful but not really anything special. We've covered this thing's playstyle extensively really, but as it doesn't have a motorised turret, it can only really be used effectively at long range, covering a narrow sightline. At the long ranges, the lack of turret drive won't be too much of a problem as you won't need to adjust as much, but at close range brawling, this thing really does struggle, and there's no need to play it here anyway. Stick to long range and it'll likely perform fine. If by this point you're confident using the Panzer IVs, you'll probably still do okay with the J despite the drawbacks. Pros: great firepower and decent mobility. And the cons: poor survivability, terrible turret traverse, and low versatility. Verdict is irrelevant. I'd avoid it. It performs worse than basically all of the other Panzer IVs in that it's just not as versatile. The armour was never really a decisive factor on these tanks, it's always been the gun, so in taking away the turret drive it does really become the least useful. You have plenty of Panzer IV backups anyway, and as this thing is folded, you don't even need to research it to progress. It'll do its job fine, but you have plenty of other options that can and will do this thing's job better. Finally, our last medium tank this tier, the first of the legendary Panther tanks. This is the D variant. Compared to the others, it's not amazingly effective, at least by comparison. To summarise the Panther D though, it is a decent vehicle. It's equipped with a new gun, a long 75mm that can punch through a max of 192mm of armour. Its explosive filler isn't that high though, at only 28 grams, although most of the time the performance is fine. If you penetrate a tank's hull, it will likely one-shot, but on some tanks with spread out crew, it is fairly common not to knock the tank out in a single shot. Overall though, the gun is good and reliable at penetrating the vast majority of enemy vehicles. Armour as well is pretty good. Most APHE below 100mm caliber can't punch through the front plate at any range. Sabo will generally get through, but that's about it. The turret is a bit easier to penetrate. Most guns have the potential to get through, but there are some wonky angles and several strong points that will bounce shots, so it's a little bit like the Tiger's mantlet in that regard, although the Panther's is notably easier to penetrate. Mobility as well is pretty good. It can reach about 40 km an hour off-road, which is fairly impressive for a tank of its size. The main drawback though is the turret traverse. Like the J, it doesn't have an electric drive, so stock with no turret drive upgrade, it can only traverse 3.6 degrees a second, which is awful, and makes its ability to react to enemies very slow. And this does really hurt the Panther D. As for its playstyle, there are a few options. Once upgraded, it can still work at close range if you're careful. As long as enemies are attacking from the front, the turret traverse won't be too much of a problem, but safe to say it is more effective at range. The further away you are, the less prominent the lack of turret traverse is, as you can effectively cover more ground. It also makes the weak spots on the turret harder to hit of course, which is another plus. The gun at range will still work very well, as it's easy to aim and will still carry enough penetration over distances to deal with pretty much everything. For playing at a close range though, the main thing to keep in mind is to not advance too far into the map early on. The D is terrible at reacting to enemies on its side, so you want to limit the possibility of this happening as much as possible. The side armour is also fairly weak, and if you over-angle, enemies can easily pass through the side. One advantage the Panthers have though for fighting at close range is something I call a pseudo-stabilizer. It of course has no stabilization, but at low speeds the Panther's gun is very stable, and if you meet an enemy head-on on the move, it's likely that you're going to get off an accurate shot. This does take time to practice, but it can definitely help you in certain situations. So if you do meet an enemy on the move and need to fire as fast as possible, don't wait for the tank to come to a stop. Reduce speed to the point where the gun is somewhat stable and take your shot. A fair few German tanks can do this somewhat effectively, and the Panther is one of the first to do it well. Give it some practice in the test range, and once you master it, you can really take some enemies by surprise. Another thing to always do is keep your turret centralized when not in combat. If you angle it off to the side to shoot an enemy, it'll take a long time to traverse back to the center, and this can catch you out if you're fighting at close range, so if possible, try and avoid moving it too far away from the middle, so that when you do meet an enemy you can react to it faster. All in all, the Panther D, because of the turret drive, does work more reliably at range. The gun is easier to aim than the Tiger's gun, so it can fill the role of a somewhat armoured, somewhat versatile sniper fairly well. Pros: great firepower, and good armour. And the cons: terrible turret traverse, and low versatility. Verdict: it'll have to be a consider it on this one, but with some caveats. This vehicle is tedious to use, and you might not have a lot of fun playing it if you're a newer player with an inexperienced crew. And also because in Tier 4 at the same BR is the Panther A, with a very fast turret drive as well as some other upgrades. So again, it gets outclassed in its playstyle at its own BR, which generally is a one-way ticket to Redundant Town. That's awful, why did I write that? Terrible. Anyway, although it can work as a sniper stock fairly well, so what I'd suggest that it's not without use is give it a go. If you like it, keep playing it to research the Panther A in Tier 4, and then replace it immediately, as there's not really a point to have both in a lineup. Give this one some thought. First for our SPA this tier is the infamous whirlwind, an incredibly effective SPA at the BR of 3.7. It's on the Panzer IV hull and equipped with quad 20mm cannons with the same belts found on the earlier flak panzers. Now, the whirlwind is considered quite OP, and I'm not quite sure if it is overpowered. It's definitely under-tiered for sure, but the main draw is really that it's just so easy to use. So even players like me who are bad with AA can knock out aircraft with it fairly easily, which could very well give the illusion that it is overpowered. The whirlwind shouldn't be 3.7, and I actually believe it was never planned on being so low. Before the camo requirements changed, the whirlwind had a camo grind equivalent to that of a Tier 4 vehicle, so initially I think they wanted it higher up, but for whatever reason bumped it down. Of course, I don't know if that's true, but it does seem somewhat likely given its performance. The guns still work great, and because of the quad arrangement, you don't need to be perfectly accurate to take your enemy out, and that's the main reason why it performs so well. A couple of hits from HE or AP rounds will likely cripple any aircraft. The only drawback with the Whirl really is its reload time. It has around a 5-second stock reload where it replenishes its 80 rounds, and that really is its only major disadvantage. As far as how to play it, well, point and click basically, it really is that easy. But be aware though that rounds don't have the highest airtime and will fizzle out, so I'd only engage if the aircraft is fairly close to you. Another reason to do this is because the whirlwind actually has a fear factor that works against it. If an enemy aircraft knows there's a whirl up, it'll likely be much more cautious and keep its distance to you, so save your burst until the aircraft is close enough where you can almost guarantee a kill. You can somewhat go tank hunting with it too. It'll take off barrels and can knock out most tanks like the T-34s and Shermans from the side, and from close range it can even kill early T-34s and Shermans from the front. It's also very effective against enemy SPA and light vehicles just because of how quickly it can fire. It absolutely shreds through these vehicles. Be careful if you're going tank hunting though, as you might run into a vehicle you can't touch anywhere like the KV series. All in all though, as far as SPA go, it is very versatile. Pros: great anti-air ability, good anti-tank ability, and good mobility. And the cons: poor survivability. Verdict: what's the point? Get it? Of course, it's one of the most effective anti-air in the game really. You can use this thing all the way up to radar AA with no trouble at all. It'll still tear through enemies very easily. It should really be up tiered, and I'm not sure why its legacy BR has lasted so long. Maybe it's just been that way for such a long time that it looks embarrassing on Gaijin's part now if they drastically raise it. Either way, whatever BR it ends up at down the line, it's always going to be incredibly effective. Next up, the Wirbel's direct successor, the Austwind. Panzer IV hull again, but this time housing a 37mm cannon, an upgrade from the previous flak truck in Tier 2. This round fires much faster and is perfectly stable really, no problems there. The only problem, really, is working out whether it's necessary. The Wirbel is so much easier to use, but it only really works well against aircraft at close range, whereas the Austwind is harder to use, as the volume of fire is more precise, but it does work better at distances. The Austwind is a bit more accurate over range, so if you're really good at aiming your SPA, the Austwind will still be a good choice, maybe even better than the Wirbel. A hit from the upgraded HE round will likely take out an aircraft in a single shot as well, and once you get the hang of it, you can be a real menace to aircraft. Its ability to take out tanks is much less reliable though. It can take out light tanks, Hellcats and SPA, but it can't really take out medium tanks with the same level of reliability the Wirbel can, so I wouldn't really go hunting tanks with it. It can still work, but it's not very reliable. As an SPA, it's still great. It has no reload and can still fire off rounds very quickly. For its playstyle, well, it's an anti-air. You don't need me to tell you what to do at this point. Pros: great anti-air ability and good mobility. And the cons: poor survivability. Verdict: consider it. Now, as an SPA, it's still one of the best World War II era examples in the game, but some of you will just prefer the whirlwind to the point where this vehicle is irrelevant. What I'd recommend is that if you're not comfortable with AAs, stick with the whirlwind for now, but if you've got your aim in and know what you're doing, the Austwind will likely have more potential just because it can fire constantly and at further ranges. So it's up to you. Both SPA work incredibly well, it's just down to your choice to which one you prefer. Next up is the Jagdpanzer 38T, the famous Hetzer, equipped with the standard 75mm gun found on the Panzer IVs. In-game, the Hetzer is pretty good, but does have some notable drawbacks. Its armour is probably its most important feature, and frontally it's great. The upper hull is around 110mm effective thickness, with the lower plate being 90, so if you play this thing behind cover hiding the lower plate, at 4.3 a lot of enemies will really have a hard time getting through the upper plate. At combat ranges, a lot of enemy guns can't even penetrate it. The American 76, Russian 76 and a lot of similar guns can't get through. Even the Russian 85 struggles past 700 meters. The lower plate though is a fairly easy pen. The transmission will likely catch a lot of the shrapnel, but it won't take long for a round to get through. The main drawback armor-wise is the protection on the sides. It's only 20mm thick, which means even if you're only slightly angled, a lot of rounds will just overmatch through the side armor, and this can happen a lot if you're not careful. Mobility as well isn't really impressive. I'd say it's about average when upgraded. And because it's not impressive, it can be quite difficult sometimes to adjust to an enemy getting an angle on you. And if you don't turn to face them quick enough, they're going to have a very easy time cutting through your sides. The Hetzer can really be devastating if played in a good spot, and that's the main caveat to playing it really. If you can find a location that covers a decent sightline with enough cover to poke your gun over, you're going to be immune from a lot of enemies around this BR, even in up tiers if you're playing at range. What I generally do is see what map I'm playing on. If I know there's a decent hull down spot I can use, I'll take out the Hetzer and play there until the enemy numbers start dwindling. Then it really depends on how the match is going. The Hetzer isn't great at reacting to changes in the match because it's so weak from every orientation apart from the front. Later on in the match where enemies are more spread out, it doesn't do that well. So generally I like to stay somewhat far back in the map. Overall, the Hetzer is a heavily defensive vehicle. It's not very versatile, but it does fill the defensive niche very, very well. Better than most vehicles, really. And this is where it works best. I don't want to say that it only works in a location like this, though. I have had some luck with playing it at close range out of cover, and you can definitely play it this way. It's easy to pigeonhole tanks for the sake of their advantages, but they can still work fine as vehicles outside those advantages. So just because there might not be the perfect spot for the Hetzer, doesn't mean you just shouldn't play it. Pros: good firepower, and great armour. And the cons: poor survivability, and low versatility. Verdicts: get it. It's a really iconic vehicle and a very functional one too, and you really can have some fantastic games with it if you can find the right spot, so give it a go. Next up is the Jagdpanzer IV, which is another casemate TD on the Panzer IV chassis of course, using the same standard 75mm gun. At 4.7, this thing is okay. It has a smaller chance to really excel than the Hetzer as its frontal armour isn't quite as strong, but overall it is more consistent. The side armour thankfully is thicker, so there's no reliable way to cheese through the sides. It's also a lot smaller and more responsive to input, so it can turn faster as well. It's an overall more rounded vehicle when compared to the Hetzer. Where the Hetzer only really excelled in armour, the Jagdpanzer IV is decent through all categories. The American 75 and Russian 76 will still struggle, but anything above that can get through if given an easy shot. Of course, as it's a turretless TD, long range is the best spot to maximise your survivability. The armour of course will be better, and because this tank is so small, it can actually become a fairly hard target to hit accurately. But even though it's suited to a more defensive role, the Jagdpanzer IV can be a little bit more aggressive than other TDs. Its mobility is about the same as the Panzer IV's, so it can comfortably reach the high 30s off-road. Its hull traverse is good, and also has 16 roof-mounted smokes if you get into trouble. The add-on armour upgrade also gives it some potential for angling, sort of. The upgrade, among other areas, adds 2 strips of track armour to the right side of the upper casemate if you're facing it. This means that if you're in close quarters, you can slightly angle to present the enemy the side with the track armour. Like the Stugs, it doesn't need much angling, it's just to give the enemy a suggestion that that side of the hull is where they should shoot. This isn't amazingly reliable, as the track armour doesn't quite cover the whole side, but in the heat of combat it can save you from time to time. Be careful you're not angling too much though, as the lower side armour is quite easy to punch through as it isn't sloped. So you have a bit of choice when playing this one. The more reliable way to play it is of course at ranges, but you can play it in close quarters a bit more reliably than the Hetzer, as long as you're careful with it. This also somewhat depends on the BR2. Upwards of 5.3, maybe even 5.0 actually, the majority of common enemy vehicles will be using guns that your armour can't negate, so this basically forces you into a more defensive role if you want to stay alive for a while. At 4.0 though, you can play it like a conventional vehicle, just rolling around and clicking on enemies. The defensive playstyle in game isn't for everyone, so in that sense the Jagdpanzer IV is a TD for people who don't like TDs really. Pros: good firepower, good mobility, and versatile. And the cons: unreliable armour. Verdict: get it. It does get outclassed fairly quickly, as we'll see next, but even then it's fine stock and will still work as a backup if you want to pop it in your lineup at a slightly higher BR. It's a functioning vehicle that's a bit more forgiving than most, so give it a shot. Next up is the Panzer IV 70V, which is a lot like the Jagdpanzer IV's angrier Council Estate older brother. It's a 5.3 but upgunned and up-armoured to the point where it can be pretty dangerous. It gets the Panther's gun, the 75mm, and 80mm of sloped frontal armour, and this is pretty good. Past around 800 meters, the upper plate is immune from the Russian 85, early 17-pounder ammo, the American 76, and all similar guns really, all the while having a cannon that can penetrate basically anything you meet. Mobility as well is decent, basically the same as the Jagdpanzer IV, it's just a tiny bit slower in practice. As far as how to play it, it's very close to the Jagdpanzer IV, it's basically just that, but upscaled to match the higher BR. It'll still work very reliably at range and still have great protection there. At close range it can still work too. The gun might struggle a little bit at 6.3, but it'll generally be fine, and the armour can protect against a lot of common guns, and as well, like the previous tank, it gets track armour on the right side of the casemate, meaning you can angle a little bit if you get into trouble from a tank with a more powerful gun. The side armour is also slightly improved, so you can do this even more effectively than before. Like the Hetzer though, if you can find a good spot to hide your lower plate, that's perfect really. It's still pretty strong, but some cannons can knock out your transmission this way, and if you're at close range, you can easily be flanked. At long range it isn't too much of a problem, as if an enemy does go for your transmission, they'll still be in front of your gun, but it's just something to be wary of if you are playing a bit more aggressively. Pros: great firepower, effective armour, good mobility, and versatile. And the cons: despite the armour, it can't always be relied on. Sorry if that con seems like a cop-out. Verdict: definitely get it. It's a good alternative to the Nashorn at 5.3. With this tank, you'll lose the power of the gun, but gain impressive survivability. It'll work great on a long-range map, or even a smaller one if you're confident. In any case, it's a great vehicle to support the Tigers and Panthers with. First off, for the premiums, we're sadly starting with a completely unobtainable one. This is the Ersatz M10, or the War Crime Panther. This is a Panther G disguised to look like an American M10, with some superficial steel plates placed all over the hull and turret. These don't really offer any meaningful armor protection though, although it does lose the cupola, which was situationally a weak spot. So armor-wise, it's not improved too much, but a little bit. As far as the 75mm Panthers go, this is likely the best out of all of them in terms of speed and survivability, which is annoying as it's not currently available in any way. As it's a past event vehicle, it's only likely to come back on the marketplace, and I can't really guess at what the price there would be. There could be a lot of coupons given out for it, or it could be a tournament reward with only a couple of them on sale. In any case, if it does come back at a reasonable price, I do recommend getting it though, as it is a really good vehicle that really just takes the best parts from all of the other Panthers pretty much. But its advantage over the Tech Tree Panthers isn't by a huge margin, so don't worry too much if you don't have one yourself yet. Next up, bit of a weird one, this is the Animal Tiger. This was a reward for the April Fool's crafting event a few years ago. It's literally an identical Tiger H1 but with a tiger themed skin. Absolutely no other changes apart from premium status. It's currently only available on the marketplace, and since the event has long gone by now, there's only a few left for sale, and it's currently just over 100 Gaijin coins to buy one, so of course it's in no way worth it. Just pop a talisman on the regular Tiger and you've basically got the same thing as this, minus the Silver Lion multiplier. Next up, another Tiger. This is the VK4501P, the Porsche prototype of the Tiger 1. It's interesting but not really as good as the regular Tiger. It has slower turret traverse, and as the sides of the front plate slope naturally, you can't even angle it to buff the armor without creating a huge weak spot. It does have a very fast reverse gear, but that's really the only thing of any advantage. This vehicle is currently only obtainable on the marketplace through the camo crates. Please don't buy loads of them to try and obtain it though. It's currently on sale for 75 Gaijin coins if you want to buy it directly, so with a price like that, it's only really there as a collectible really, and not worth it as a premium. It's not a good grinder and doesn't really perform exceptionally well, or to be honest, offer anything special over the Tiger H1. Next up is quite the famous vehicle. This is the Finnish KV1B. It's identical to the KV1E in the Russian tree, but in being in the German line, the biggest threat to its armor is basically gone. So even though the vehicle is the same, the performance is drastically increased. The armor on this thing is unrivaled really. And tier for tier, the KV1B would be a strong contender for having the most reliable armor out of any tank in the game. The base level of armor thickness is 75mm all over pretty much, with an additional 25mm covering most of the vehicle, the turret, front plate and some of the side armor. If angled, this thing really is a monster, and if it's driving around on the move, getting that perfect shot on flat armor is really tricky. Its gun is its only drawback though. At 4.0 it can only penetrate up to 86mm of armor, so it can struggle with some tanks, but overall it really is a force to be reckoned with, and like a lot of captured German vehicles, it's comfortably one of the best tanks in the game. Unfortunately though, it's a marketplace vehicle and quite a rare one. The lowest it's going for at time of recording is 127 Gaijin coins, which is a huge amount really. Again, it can be won out of the camo boxes, though I wouldn't really recommend rolling for one of these, as you will likely lose a lot of money. But this does mean that there will be a trickle of them on the marketplace at all times. If you really want to splash out, it is a very functional vehicle at its PR, but I wouldn't really recommend paying that much for any vehicle ever, really. But if you try to play the market and flip things to build up some cash, this is a great vehicle to put the money towards. It's great, but as a product, it's not really worth the current price. Next up, another infamous vehicle. This is the VFW. Firepower wise, it's incredibly effective really. It's equipped with a variant of the long 88mm cannon, which has a little bit less penetration than the regular variants, but it's so similar to the point where you'd rarely notice the difference. Also, if you were to put an ace crew on it, it has a minimum reload of 4 seconds with the sides down, which is the same speed as the auto-loading Lorraine can fire. This firepower potential is basically unmatchable this tier, so the VFW can be a really dangerous vehicle. Its armor though is non-existent. 50 cals can rip right through, and since this last week it can now hull break, so a single heat round hitting anywhere or a shot through the engine or breech will total it, which is a problem as it's so large. Mobility wise, it's not bad. It's fairly fast and can reposition without much hassle. And also, it has a rangefinder as it's technically an anti-air vehicle, so you can easily and accurately land shots past 2,000 meters, which is another huge advantage. As it's a marketplace vehicle though, the price keeps changing. It's currently just under 30 Gaijin coin, which is on the higher end of what I'd recommend buying it for. For the price of the VFW, you could potentially buy 2 premiums and a talisman this tier, and because it can now hull brake, I'm not sure if it's entirely worth it. It is a really functional vehicle though, the gun will always work, and it'll still perform great in up tiers and pretty much on all maps too. And it'll also fit into a lot of lineups. You will get a huge use out of it, but it's not quite as forgiving as it used to be. It can work well anywhere really, but it does excel at long range just because it's so hard to counter. It fires incredibly fast and can range find accurately and will likely one-shot whatever it penetrates. So I'd recommend covering a fairly active sightline with it, as you do have the potential to take out a lot of enemies. I'd also say it works best as a first spawn vehicle, as you'll be able to easily catch out enemies moving into the map on some of the larger maps, and later on in the game there'll be a lot of aircraft flying about, and of course the VFW is very weak to aircraft. It plays quite similarly to the Nashorn, but you can afford to be a bit less careful with it this time around. Pros: great firepower, fast reload, and good mobility. And the cons: poor survivability. Is it worth it? Well, actually I'm going to say yes. If the price stays around this level, it is expensive for what it is, but it's very easy to use and is one of the most consistent premiums you'll have access to this tier. It'll work well beyond its BR and on all maps, and that's an advantage you really do have to consider. These things won't be around forever, so if you do want one for yourself, I would pick it up soon, as the price will steadily rise over time. The VFW can be a huge hazard to the enemy team if played carefully and not too aggressively. If you think your playstyle would suit this vehicle, definitely consider it, but even though it's great, it's still not the best value for money. Next up, another captured tank. This is the Churchill Mark III. And for the sake of comparison, it's a bit like a poor man's KV1B. It performs basically the same job, just slightly less reliably at 4.0. The armour is still great, but not as powerful, the mobility is easily worse, but the gun is pretty good and will be able to deal with most enemies somewhat easily. It will struggle with the sloping of Shermans and some T-34s at range, but most other vehicles won't pose too much of a threat. Compared to the KV1B, the armour does have potential, but it takes more effort to make it truly effective. If you angle the hull, very few tanks will be able to cut through. You can even angle the turret as well to make it immune from guns like the Russian 76 and the American 75. There is still a weak spot on the turret where the armor normalizes, but I found this spot is rarely hit. The main advantage of this tank, like the Tiger 1, is the window of reaction time you have. And the Churchill Mark III can make really good use of this. The gun can penetrate up to 132mm off flat armour and also comes with a short stabilizer. So if you're quick, most of the time you will get an accurate shot off on your enemies faster than they can, and that's what makes the Churchill so good overall. It can catch enemies out in those vital seconds. This tank works great as long as you can control, or at least be aware of where enemies are engaging you from. This thing can get caught out if an enemy is engaging at close range, it's slow and will struggle to maneuver, if an enemy is attacking from another angle other than the front, so try not to advance too far into the map, to the point where enemies can potentially come at you from lots of different angles. The Churchill works best at close and mid-range, close for the potential of the gun, and mid for maximising the armour. Both of these distances have their benefits, so it's up to you where you'd most rather play. One thing to always do though, especially with heavy tanks like this, is keep on the move, even if it's just driving back and forth. Your armour is flat, and in staying still, an enemy can quite easily and quickly scope out the weakest parts of your armour. If you're on the move, it becomes a lot more difficult for them. My general strategy with meeting an enemy is to drive forward angled so they can't hit my front plate, stop and fire as quickly as possible into their breach. This gun is good, but not as powerful as the German cannons you'll be used to, so going for that disabling shot first is the way to go. Always remain angled in any case, as in doing this, you practically make the hull immune from enemy guns. This tank does take a while to master, but when you do master it, it has tons of potential. Pros: great armour, and good firepower. And the cons: poor mobility. So, the main question, is it worth it? Well, it comes in at 1,600 Golden Eagles, which is actually pretty cheap, especially for a tier 3 vehicle that has this much potential. At 4.0, there's a good lineup for Germany, but the only thing it lacks is an effective heavy tank. It has some good TDs, versatile medium tanks, but nothing quite like this when it comes to armour. The Churchill fits almost perfectly into this lineup and it adds a missing element. It's not going to work on every map and its armour does lose its effectiveness at the higher BRs, but with how versatile the 4.0 lineup is, if the map isn't great or the BRs unfavourable, you can just play another vehicle. The main drawback with it is that it doesn't have much longevity, and all in all, it's not the most versatile premium this tier, but out of all of the accessible vehicles, it's probably the most effective at its own BR arguably. There's one more vehicle coming that might challenge that, but I'd say it'd be close. It's cheap, and if you like lower tier battles, it will add a somewhat unique playstyle. So, for all of these reasons, I can comfortably say that it is worth it. It's not the best consistency-wise, but when it works, it really does work. Next up is the Panzer BFW4, which is basically the command variant of the PanzerforG. Yes, sadly it's the J. All its changes are superficial really. The extra side skirts are only structural steel, so they don't really offer any protection. It also doesn't have the roof-mounted smoke launcher. If the PanzerforG was a cake, the BFW would be an identical cake with a handful of brightly coloured sprinkles on top for twice the price. Obnoxious analogy aside, it's really not worth it as a premium. It costs 1,750 GE, which isn't a huge amount, but it's the worst model of Panzer IV, and the talisman on the G is only 1,100. The only reason to buy this would be to have a silver lion grinder really, and even then there are better premiums this tier to choose from. As a vehicle, it'll rarely excel, but it does have the advantage of working in up tier as the gun will largely still do fine. The reward multipliers it has are still pretty good, but buying it won't really bring a lot to the experience. It's close to being an identical tech tree vehicle, so you're not paying for the extra playstyle. It won't add anything to any lineups. The actual playstyle it has is limited, but it is versatile in that it will work sniping on most maps and in up tiers, and that really is an important factor to consider. I wouldn't say it's a terrible decision to buy this one, but in my opinion it's easily one of the weaker options you have. Next up is a very famous vehicle. This is the captured KV2 Model 1940. The turret is slightly different to the mainline Russian example. It gets a coaxial MG and a cupola, which in game serves nothing but to be an extra weak spot. Sadly, the glory days of the KV2 in War Thunder are over, really, for now anyway. Its main shell isn't hugely impressive, only 95mm of penetration. It can non-pen somewhat regularly now. The HE as well isn't what it was, but it will still take vehicles out. The KV2 is now somewhat mediocre, and as a premium, even more so. It's a really cool vehicle, and that really is the only allure for it, as it has a 2,980 Golden Eagle price tag. As a grinder, it's not that great. The armour isn't reliable, and with inconsistent firepower and a base reload of 4.3 seconds, with a gun that isn't that easy to aim at range, you have all the makings of a vehicle with very limited scope. As a tank in game, it's fun and does the job of a scary high caliber tank very well, but as a product, it just isn't really worth paying for. It's one of the least versatile tanks you have access to. Most of the time you'll get a few kills but be overwhelmed fairly quickly, and that makes for a fairly annoying vehicle to play with the intention of grinding with it. As a product, it isn't worth it really, but as a fun vehicle to play with some friends, lobbing HE at people, you can't really go wrong. If you get it on discount, it can be fun to take out from time to time, but just don't expect to have consistent high-scoring games with it. If you're looking for a vehicle to grind the tree with, this isn't really it. Unless you prefer arcade mode though, as it's a lot easier there as you get the aim indicator. For RB though, despite how legendary this vehicle is, your money can be better spent. Sorry KV2. Next up is the KV1C, which is a pretty unique vehicle considering what it is. It's of course a C model of the KV1 tanks, which the Russian tree doesn't even have, and this one has been fitted with the Panzer IV's gun, the 75mm, which combines the great armour from the KV series with the firepower of the Germans, which is a really effective combination. It's a lazy comparison, but this tank really is like a baby tiger. Hull armour is great when angled, the turret can be penetrated but not consistently, and it has a large cupola weak spot. Mobility for a heavy tank as well is good. It's responsive, it can reach a decent speed overall, so basically everything I've recommended playstyle wise with the Tiger is mostly applicable here. The only additional thing I'd say is to angle the right side of the tank towards your enemies if possible, as this makes the machine gun port and the driver's port weak spots harder to hit. Anyway, quite surprisingly, this tank is really cheap, at only 1,600 Golden Eagles, especially considering how effective it can be. Its armour will start to lose its reliability past 5.0, but above that it can still function fine really. The gun is still effective and can still be a decent backup if nothing else. It can brawl well, snipe, and all around be fairly versatile. It can be caught out at close range as its ability to turn isn't incredible, and it doesn't have the best gun depression, but all in all, it's a really good pick that'll work brilliantly at its BR and won't be unusable at higher BRs. It'll just effectively turn into a slow medium tank. Pros: great armour, good firepower, and versatile. And the cons: somewhat sluggish, and large cupola weak spot. Is it worth it? Depending on what BR you want to really main this tier, I guess, the KV1C might be the best pick for a premium. It'll work great in multiple different scenarios, and it is really cheap too. I'd say it's definitely worth it, and it does play somewhat similarly to the Tiger, so if you do plan on buying it, it will be a good vehicle to practice with, getting the hang of constantly angling and making sure your cupola isn't too exposed. I wouldn't say it's a necessity, but you will get a lot of use out of it, and it's good to have at least one premium that you like for the Silver Lion boost. Irrespective of talismans, it's probably the best choice this tier, probably. Next up, quite a unique vehicle, this is the Boombar, a casemate SPG that uses effectively the same gun as the Sturmpanzer in Tier 1. The rounds are the same and so is the velocity, etc. This one is built on the chassis of the Panzer IV, but its mobility isn't quite as good. The Boombar can be fairly sluggish. Armour though, for a 4.7 is surprisingly impressive. Its main sloping plate is 100mm thick with an effectiveness of around 130mm. Its lower plate as well is 100mm thick, 2 layers of 50mm. So protection is pretty good, and so is the firepower and arguably the mobility. But of course, with a gun like this, the tedium comes in actually landing your shots, which can be difficult. But unlike the Sturmpanzer, the Boombar can actually brawl a bit, or rather, it can play more safely at a close range, which it really needs to be able to land shots easily. You can try and play it at range, lobbing shots over hills, etc., and this can be fun if you want to challenge yourself or get some really lucky kills, but it's not going to be amazingly consistent, and these little reviews are more from the perspective of buying a tank to grind with. And the Boombar isn't amazing for grinding. It's very easy to miss your shots at range, and if you're not on a map with a decent sightline, you're likely going to struggle to get a lot of kills. The most appealing thing in a premium really is consistency, and although the Boombar can selectively work very well, the only thing it isn't is consistent, and since you can't really control what map you're going to get, you're not going to be able to take it out on every map and have a good time, which is a real drawback for it. However, as a vehicle, it is fun, and that's also a big advantage for it as a premium. You'll need to play it a fair bit to get the hang of the gun, but when you do, you can splat basically everything you meet, which is satisfying and enjoyable. The Boombar as well has a bit of a fear factor. Enemies won't want to push you, and will be very cautious about attacking you. If you're hull down at 4.7, there's not a lot of vehicles that can actually get through the upper plate, apart from probably the British, so if you can find a safe position, you can do a lot of work with the Boombar, but overall, it is more of a gimmick vehicle. Although, it wouldn't be fair to completely ignore its potential for arcade mode. Its only real negative is that the gun is hard to aim, and in arcade, it's much easier. You can also very easily lob shots over hills using binocular aiming, which can be really satisfying too. Pros: great armour, and great firepower. And the cons: poor mobility, long reload, and low versatility. Is it worth it? For arcade, I'd say yes. You can knock out anything with it potentially, and once you get the hang of the aiming, you'll easily have a good time. For RB though, it's much harder to use and very inconsistent in regards to maps. The Boombar works best when covering a narrow sightline. On open maps, it's too easy to get shot in the side, and to be honest, a lot of other vehicles this BR just have more potential. It's worth it for a bit of fun if you get it on discount, but as a dedicated grinder for just under 3000 GE, your money could easily be better spent. Lastly today is the Panzerfor 70A, which despite the name, performs very differently to the V. It's at 5.0, which is the lowest of the 75mm guns BR-wise, unless you want to be pedantic about the French, but its gun is really the only advantage. As you can see, there's a big flat slab of armour in the middle that's unangled and only 80mm thick. Because it's higher up, the sloped part of armour is more effective than the V in the main tree, but that doesn't really count for much when there's this huge blatant weak spot right in the middle. So, of course, you could play to hide this weak spot, which isn't impossible. The problem is, if you can't hide it, the vehicle just becomes a bit useless. On top of this, as it's a 5.0 vehicle, there's not a lineup for it to fit into. There's no reason basing one around it, and at 5.3, where there is a lineup, is a vehicle that's objectively better and with basically the same effective playstyle. This vehicle can be immune pretty much at 5.0 if it's perfectly hull down, but that's such a situational advantage and very map dependent. The gun will always work though, which is a plus for it, but the price is really high at 3,850 Golden Eagles, which is more than double some vehicles this tier. I believe this is the case because this vehicle is an old removed pack vehicle that was later brought back as a GE premium. So in order to not annoy people who bought it at a higher price, it's here where it is, which really makes it stupidly redundant on multiple levels. It could be 4.7, but that wouldn't really help the problems it has. The weak spot would still be a weak spot. Maybe they should just coat it in track armor, that would at least help a little bit. Safe to say though that it's not worth it. It's expensive, doesn't have a lineup, and 90% of the time it's a very easy kill. I wouldn't even consider this one, especially considering that a talisman on the V variant in the main tree is nearly 3 times as cheap. First off for the planes, we're starting with the Dornier 217s. There are 4 Dornier bombers to choose from, the E2, E4, K1 and M1. They all have slight changes. The M1 is the fastest and the E's have a 20mm cannon operated by the pilot, but for CAS they all perform basically the same. They all get a final bomb load of 4 1000kg bombs with 3 drops, 1 double and 2 singles. This gives it a lot of potential for damage, but defensively the Dorniers aren't too impressive. They're not incredibly slow, but also not fast enough to evade most fighters. In any case, for CAS, if you prefer bomber aircraft, the 217s are a very solid choice. Next up are some fighters. This is the Focke-Wulf 190 F8, an attacker variant. It gets some fairly ineffective rockets and some relatively effective 30mm gun pods, although these really kill the flight performance. But finally it gets a fairly decent bomb load for a fighter, one 1000kg bomb and 4 50s that drop in pairs. It's not the best, but for 4.7 you have one great bomb drop and then you have a moderately effective fighter, so it's definitely one to consider. Next is the TAR 152C3. It's a very powerful and fast fighter and gets one centre-mounted 30mm cannon with full HVAP and 90 rounds. It's really effective as a fighter and ground attacker, but, and this is a fairly rotund but, spaded it costs around 34,000 lines to repair, so I wouldn't really recommend it too much as you can't really guarantee you'll make a profit while playing it, but it's a very functional plane when upgraded, and if you're confident or have lots of lions, you can mop up with it, but if not, the repair cost likely won't be worth it. Next up is the ME410 B6R3. This variant comes with 2 20mm cannons and 2 30mm cannons with full HVAP belts and 120 rounds per gun. This aircraft shreds enemy tanks with ease and can take out aircraft pretty reliably too. It's very stable and has loads of potential even if they're enemy aircraft or anti-air up, as it can deal with them fairly well. I would almost say this 410 is a must-have as it's so effective and versatile. If you like aircraft with cannon CAS armament, you'll really enjoy the R3. Next up, the famous Dornier 335, and this is the A1 variant. It's very fast and can carry 2 250kg bombs and 1 500kg bomb. On top of this, it has a 30mm HVAP cannon in the nose with 70 rounds, and also comes with 15mm guns in the nose too. With a cement core belt, they can penetrate 50mm of armor max, which isn't too bad to fall back on. It can also turn pretty well at certain speeds, but suffers a lot if caught on low energy. It can take a while to master, but has a decent amount of potential. Next up is the 335B2 variant. It gets the same bomb load but comes with 2 extra 30mm cannons in the wings, giving it a wide spread of fire and 350 30mm rounds total, which is pretty fantastic. Although it is a premium and at 4,880 GE, it's a fairly expensive one too. It does have more potential than the ME410, but that aircraft can do this one's job fairly well too. Not to discount how effective this Dornier can be though, it's really quick and can do a huge amount of damage if left alone. But it does play similarly to the B6, so you're not missing out on a different playstyle by not buying it. It is really good though, and in any case, if you ever get a discount on it, I would definitely pick it up. Next up is the HE219A7. Again, it's a lot like the ME410, it gets 2 20s and 4 30s, although only 2 of them fire HVAP. It's fairly fast but not very agile and can easily get caught out by enemy fighters, although it's pretty good at pulling out of steep dives. and it's also another premium at 2,980 GE. It's not overly expensive, but not quite as versatile as the ME410, although it is only 4.3, an entire BR below the 410. It's a functional aircraft, but I'd only really recommend getting it if you plan on playing a lot of games around this battle rating. It gets outclassed fairly quickly by mainline and other premiums, so it's up to you. It's not a bad aircraft at all, but it probably wouldn't be my top pick. Lastly today is the Ju-288C. This is a very fast bomber with great defensive guns and payload. It can carry Satan bombs, those are 1,800 kilogram bombs, and it gets 2 that drop separately. This gives the 288 huge potential for damage, and because of how huge the bombs are, you don't really need to be that accurate either. The downside though, of course, is the price. It's 4,880 G currently, which is a lot for a CAS aircraft. It's probably the most capable prop bomber Germany gets, but once you get more confident with tech tree bombers, you can get very similar results to the Ju-288. If you've got the cash, it is worth it as it's a really functional aircraft, but it's in no way a necessity. So that's everything for today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Sorry again that it was so long. On screen now are what I think are probably the best lineups you can make for Tier 3 Germany. Of course, for 5.7, there are some tanks in Tier 4 that would probably work better, but again, I will still do a big roundup at the very end. So yeah, Tier 3 done. This has probably been the longest video so far, as I think there's 25 vehicles for Tier 3 Germany, which is kind of crazy. But it should get slowly easier to make these down the line, finishing Germany off, as there's not that many vehicles tier for tier. So hopefully, I know I say this every time, it's probably started to lose all meaning. Hopefully the next one won't take as long as all of the other ones have so far. I'm very sorry. And again, thank you so much for 20,000 subscribers. That's really a huge number. I can't even visualize that many people. So again, consider subscribing if you like, as there will be a lot more of these to come, and subscribers make YouTube happy, and it makes me happy too. Anyway, I've taken up about a 24th of your day, so thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.